Thank you very much. It's great to be here this morning. Thank you all for coming. I know it's a very busy time for you because you have exams. It's the end of the year. You're probably thinking about New Year and what to buy as presents for all your loved ones. So it's a very busy time, and it's great that you can spare an hour to be here for this lecture. The lecture is on the crisis of the liberal world order. And I've given it the title, End of History Hubris. Why? Because, of course, 25 years ago, Francis Fukuyama, the American political scientist, coined this phrase, end of history. But of course, he didn't coin it. This is an idea that came from the German idealist philosopher Hegel. And Hegel had written a lot about the end of history. What did Hegel mean, and what did Fukuyama mean when he used this idea again 25 years ago? Not, of course, that history ends in any silly sense, like there are no longer any events, time stops. Of course not. The end of history was basically the sense that there was only going to be one universal idea. Okay? And that idea for Fukuyama was the idea that the whole world would gradually converge towards Western liberal democracy. Okay? That was all that end of history really meant. But it wasn't just that national politics everywhere in the world, Fukuyama was arguing, would move in this direction. Because if every country at some point becomes a liberal democracy, then of course that also has very important consequences for the international order, right? It's no longer a competition between capitalism and communism, or between maybe democracy and totalitarianism like in the first half of the 20th century. No, it would be very much a liberal world order, where liberal ideas and liberal institutions now determine the relations between states and also politics within states. Okay? So that was the idea. But I don't really want to start by analyzing what Fukuyama really meant. Was he right? Was he wrong? And so on. There have been whole libraries written on the end of history. So I'm not going to go over that. I want to start with, in fact, a quote from someone very different, because it's going to give you the general idea of what I'm going to say this morning. And the quote is from George Kennan. Who knows George Kennan? When have you heard the name of George Kennan, if at all? No? No one has heard George Kennan? That's fine. George Kennan was a US diplomat in the Soviet Union who was the intellectual founding father of the doctrine of containment, okay, during the Cold War. So he was the one who basically, he was the intellectual architect of the policy of containment. In other words, trying to contain Stalinist Soviet Union. Okay? That was the policy. Trying to push back communism, trying to avoid a communist takeover of countries like Greece, okay, or indeed other parts of Europe or the world. So you might think someone who is very much defending the West and maybe perhaps an enemy of the Soviet Union, Russia, but not at all. He was a diplomat based here in Moscow, and he had a rather good understanding of what was going on. And I want to read you this quote. And the quote is from a book which is called Russia and the West under Lenin and Stalin. Interesting that he uses the word Russia, not Soviet Union. And here's what he writes on page 17 of this book. And the book was published in 1960. The lecture on which it's based was given in 1957, so a few years after the death of Stalin. This is what he writes. And I quote from George Kennan. "There is, let me assure you, nothing in nature more egocentrical than embattled democracy." I'll read it and then we'll go over it. "Embattled democracy soon becomes the victim of its own propaganda. It tends to attach to its own cause an absolute value, which distorts everything else. Its enemy becomes the embodiment of all evil. Its own side, on the other hand, is the center of all virtue. End of quote. What's he saying here? He's saying when democracy is embattled, when a democracy is under siege, when democracy is being attacked, it becomes basically very binary. It thinks that everyone else is the enemy, everyone else is evil, and only democracy is good. Very interesting, because that's exactly what happened at the end of the Cold War and in the last 25 years, when the West has been saying, we're the good guys, and everyone who opposes us, right, is the bad guys. Saddam Hussein, Milosevic in Serbia, maybe more recently Russia and China, right? They're the enemy, we're the good guys. It's very simple. It's an easy world, white and black. Okay? But he was warning against this. He didn't think that this was right. He said, if you think like this, then you are not going to be able to have a world of cooperation where you solve problems and where you actually have peace and partnership. Because this is what he goes on to say on the same page. So I'm reading on the quote. The contest, he writes, comes to be viewed as having a final apocalyptic quality. If we lose, that is democracy, all is lost. Life will no longer be worth living. There will be nothing to be salvaged, nothing to be saved. If we win, if democracy wins, then everything will be possible. All our problems will become soluble. All our problems can be solved. The one great source of evil, our enemy, will have been crushed, the forces of goodwill then swept forward unimpeded. All worthy aspirations will be satisfied. So he's basically saying democracy can easily become triumphalist. Right? And then what happens? You try and remake the whole world in your image. Everyone has to be like you. Everyone has to be a Western liberal democracy. Culture, civilization, historical differences don't matter. And he was warning, he's saying this is very bad. This will lead to conflict. This will lead even perhaps to war. Okay, so George Kennan was not an apologist of the West. He was very critical about certain tendencies in the West. He died, I think, in 1997. He was already, I think, 99 years old. He lived a long life. And he was very critical about Fukuyama when Fukuyama wrote in 1989 that the whole world will and should become a liberal democracy. So why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this to basically put this in context. The liberal world order is not something which has existed for 100 years or 200 years. It's something very, very specific, going back to 1945 and especially 1989. And it's not necessarily a good system for international relations. That's what I want to argue this morning. So let me then begin my argument by saying that, well, what is the world order, the liberal world order? We need to, of course, define it. It's basically a set of institutions and rules. What are the institutions of the liberal world order? Well, as I said, they go back to 1945. First of all, of course, we have the United Nations. But the United Nations really is not the heart of it, because that's an institution of which all countries are a member, right? Russia, China, Western countries, the whole world. So it's not really the core of it. The core of it are the Western institutions. Bretton Woods, the IMF and the World Bank, set up in 1944. And then, of course, we get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was very much written by Western experts. It was sort of accepted by others, but now countries are saying, well, maybe we need to change some of the language to reflect our values as well. Okay, so this was very much a Western document. The Geneva Genocide Convention. And then, of course, institutions such as NATO. NATO is really at the heart of the Western liberal world order because it's, of course, the security and the military alliance. Later, of course, we have the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which then became the World Trade Organization, which Russia joined a few years ago. Now, this liberal world order really came into being and emerged because we had seen 2 world wars and different countries wanted to stop another world war from happening. So there are some good intentions. there are some important ideas here that need to be recognized. The idea that countries can only solve conflict not just by working bilaterally, but by working in a multilateral framework. Okay? So that's important. And yes, you could say for some time this order was working because no Third World War happened. Even at the height of the Cold War, all the tensions over nuclear missiles, remember, America stationing missiles in Turkey, the Soviet Union responding by stationing missiles in Cuba, right? And all the other tensions, India and China during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China during the Cold War, the Vietnam War, you know, all sorts of very dangerous moments, but we never saw a nuclear confrontation. And part of that is because of the institutions of the liberal world order. So I think it's important to recognize that, yes, this model has had some success. First complication really is that actually this model was always geographically more limited. It was never really about the whole world. It was mostly about the West and its allies. So this model is not so much a world order as an Atlantic, right, order. It's really about the Atlantic part of the world. North America, US and Canada, and Western Europe, as well as its allies, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, right, and some of the other allies elsewhere, notably Turkey. But of course, as I said, Turkey is in a very distinct position because it's a Western ally, it's part of NATO, but at the same time, at the same time, of course, it has a very special geographic location in the Middle East. And that's part of the reason why the US and Europe has always wanted to maintain NATO in its orbit. Maintain Turkey in its orbit because it occupies such a strategic position. But of course, what's very interesting is that when you look at Turkey's development today, you can't really say that Turkey is liberal in any sense of the word, political, cultural. And you also have to now wonder whether it's actually a democracy. Now, we can debate that maybe later during questions, but, you know, the West, of course, has always been, you could say, rather hypocritical when it comes to its allies, because it's also, of course, supported dictatorships, you know, in all sorts of contexts, in Latin America, in Central America, but also elsewhere. So this rhetoric of democracy, of course, is something we need to be very critical about. But really what I want to focus on is what's happened since 1989. Because then really there was a sense in which this was not just part of the Atlantic world, it was going to go global. Everyone was going to move in this direction of a liberal democracy and the liberal world order. But of course, that's not what happened. We had a very brief period where America assumed global hegemony, where there was a sort of unipolarity in place. Okay? At the time, in the 1990s, when, of course, Russia was going through a difficult transition, China was only beginning to reorient its economy, and the US was the only global superpower in economic terms, in military terms, in diplomatic terms, in political and in cultural terms. And the cultural element is important here. This isn't just about politics. This isn't just about institutions. This isn't even just about money and the economy. This is also about projecting your values and projecting your culture. And if you think back to the 1990s, then what you get in the 1990s is a very aggressive, very aggressive promotion of US culture, Hollywood, right, and all of the sort of cultural symbols of America. Of course, spread through the market, spread through diplomacy, and that's when you get this notion that Joseph Nye has developed called soft power. What is soft power? Soft power is basically a way of saying we are going to have influence not just through the traditional mechanisms of diplomacy or through our nuclear and military capability, but also by basically spreading our way of life. Okay, all the symbols, Coca-Cola, Hollywood movies, jeans, you know, wearing jeans like apparently everyone does in America, etc., etc. These are very important cultural symbols, right? McDonald's, you know, all the things that you can think of that sort of reflect American ways of life. So, what's happened? Well, what's happened is that for a very brief period, this order seemed to be the dominant one, and then, of course, things went in a rather different direction. First of all, what we had was, of course, a pushback, because when America went into NATO went into Kosovo, already there was much resistance to this approach. And we all remember, of course, that it was led by Russia. The bigger event was, of course, Iraq. And leading the resistance to the invasion of Iraq was again Russia, and in this case joined by France and Germany. And that was significant because for the first time there was a real deep split within the Western alliance. NATO was deeply divided over Iraq. And in that sense, the liberal world order was already not going very well. But the much bigger shock to this system was the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. Because that financial crisis basically led to a situation where you had a recession, a very deep recession in America, in Britain, and in other Western countries. And the whole Washington consensus, this economic model we call neoliberalism, really came to crash down and was now questioned. But even there, of course, we need to remember that this financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 was not the first one, not at all. What happened is that since the early 90s, we had seen a very frequent succession of financial crises. 1994 in Mexico, okay, and already there was a big pushback against free trade. So when Donald Trump, the new American president, says, I don't like the free trade arrangement with Mexico and Canada, right, the NAFTA agreement, the North American Free Trade Area, he was by no means the first one. There were people long before him in Mexico, in Canada, in America who were saying free trade is very dangerous for certain parts of the economy, for certain parts of the population. You lose jobs. There's lots of social disruption. Okay, so this is a long time in the making. Trump doesn't come from anywhere. There's a long history to why you get Donald Trump. 1997, we have a crisis in East Asia, a very serious financial crisis that threatened many successful economies in East Asia. 1998, of course, we have the debt crisis here in Russia, right? Because Russia had taken on a lot of debt in the transition from the Soviet Union to independence, and clearly that whole transition economically was very, very difficult and didn't work out well because it's the wrong model. Shock therapy was not a good way to try and turn the Soviet economy and its legacy into something more competitive. So, again, there's a long history to what is happening. But in 2007 and 2008, the crisis spread, you could say, from the periphery, from other parts of the world, to the heart of the liberal order, to America, to Britain, to Western Europe, to Japan. And Japan, of course, had economic problems already since the 1990s. And when a crisis goes from the periphery to the center, usually something very fundamental changes. So what's the fundamental change? Well, I'll just mention it in two words. Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. Why? Because Brexit means that for the first time the European Union is losing a major member. The European Union is no longer expanding and deepening. It's actually now disintegrating, at least in the sense of Britain leaving. And the Eurozone is not suddenly becoming a centralized system with a single finance ministry and so on. No, it's actually really run by one country, which is Germany. So there's less European integration, and there's certainly no enlargement. Turkey is never going to join the European Union. Not in my lifetime, not in yours, I don't think ever. And there are very few things you can say about the world that will never take place, but that, I think, is one of them. And it doesn't matter whether we think it's a good thing or a bad thing. The main thing is just to observe that all the things we thought would happen, all the expectations we had in 1989 and in 1991 have simply not become reality. Okay? The West is not leading the world any longer in any clear sense. Europe is not becoming more integrated and expanding. And neoliberalism is not the only model. Okay, now NATO is no longer seen as the only military alliance. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which Russia, of course, is a major member, is important, as are other initiatives. Now, for the moment, no one has replaced America as the single most powerful country. It is still the single most powerful country in military terms and in economic terms. America has 900 military bases around the world. It's the only country, for the moment, that can intervene almost anywhere in the world militarily. Now, of course, it wouldn't intervene directly in China or directly in Russia or any other nuclear power, because that would lead to a nuclear conflict which America might win, but of course at huge costs. But it has the ability at least to intervene on the margins. It could intervene in North Korea. It has the ability to intervene. What will be the cost for the Koreans, North Koreans and South Koreans? We don't know, probably very high. Right? It can intervene in Taiwan. It can say we will protect Taiwan from any Chinese military intervention. At least America could attempt this. No other country has the same reach. No other country for the moment has the same economy, one where you're attracting a lot of capital. Other countries are buying US Treasury bonds because they trust America is a strong economy. That's why the Chinese have spent probably about $2 trillion buying up US Treasury bonds. That's a sign of confidence in the US economy. But, of course, things have changed massively. China is the fastest growing economy or one of the fastest growing economies in the world, catching up quickly with America in some ways. And of course, militarily, China is also hugely expanding. But Russia, of course, has gone through a period of military modernization. And even if it started from a different level, because in the 1990s, of course, there was much less investment in defense, nevertheless, it's clear that now the US would try and avoid, in almost all contexts, any kind of confrontation with Russia, because the Russian nuclear arsenal and the Russian naval and air force capabilities are expanding. And Syria, of course, is only one example of a Russian intervention that America would have tried to prevent 5 or 10 years ago, but which now it cannot prevent, unless it wants to go to war with Russia, which I don't think most US generals really do, whatever the hysteria in America about Russian threats, or Russian meddling in the election, which of course is complete nonsense, because Facebook advertising does not change the views of millions of Americans who didn't vote for Hillary Clinton but voted for Donald Trump instead. So the idea that somehow one country, whichever country, Russia, China, any, can determine an election is absurd. So if there's a crisis of the liberal order, it's not so much to do with other powers, it's not primarily to do with China or Russia or any other country, it's to do with Western countries and their own crisis. So then the question is, can this liberal order actually recover from the current crisis it's in? And here I think one has to probably say two things. One is, it's true that it's in crisis, but at the same time it's still the single most dominant system. Think about it. Yes, we have seen some form of multipolarity. The rise of China, the rise of other countries, including China, like the BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now also South Africa. But have these countries really adopted a model that's fundamentally different? Well, yes and no. Domestically, sure, they have their own political systems. Right? China is certainly not a liberal democracy. Right? It's a one-party state which has capitalism, but also still defends the idea of an alternative to liberalism. After all, the Chinese president Xi Jinping calls this socialism with Chinese characteristics. Okay? And he's very clear that China will not have liberal institutions, will not have elections like you have in Western countries, will not have the same party system, will not have the same judicial system. So there are some fundamental domestic differences. Russia is a democracy in the sense that you have regular elections, in the sense that you have a constitution that guarantees rights, but you can also say that in effect, the way that this system operates is also very different from other political systems. There's a lot of power in the hands of small groups, there's a lot of wealth in the hands of small groups, and of course elections are not really how power is decided. Now, you might say it's a good thing or bad thing, and we can have that discussion, but of course it's a complex case. Russia is much more democratic and much more liberal than China, but it's a very different kind of system from the US or France or Britain or Germany. Because in the Chinese constitution, you don't have any of the guarantees that you have. Chinese people don't travel in the way that Russians do. Chinese people don't have the same press freedom that you have. Right? The levels of censorship in China online and in the state media are infinitely bigger than what you have here. Okay, so there are all sorts of differences that we can point to. But you could also say that there are lots of similarities with the liberal order. China has clearly adopted capitalism. State capitalism, but capitalism nevertheless. Okay, you now have nearly 100 Chinese billionaires. It's not really very communist, is it? Russia has been moving in a direction of capitalism for 25 years. Again, the state has become more influential in the last 10 years, but it's still capitalism in the sense that people are trying to make a profit. The question is, where does the profit go? Who benefits? That is a big question. And then we should, I think, bear in mind 3 points about the West. The first one is, the United States isn't just powerful today. It may decline, true, but it may not. China is catching up and fast, but there's one factor which could really change the future, and that is demography. America is a very young country and is becoming younger, by which I mean what? Not only does it have a short history, right? 300, whatever it is, 20 years or so. And of course, most countries have a history that goes back 1,000 years, 2,000, 3,000. So of course, America is always a young country in that sense. And we, who aren't Americans, like to make fun of our American friends because they have no sense of history. And it's sort of true, but that's not my point. My point is that it's a young country when you look at the population. Why? Because it benefits hugely from immigration of very young, very dynamic people. And people who have still quite strong birth rates. So especially the Latino immigration into America, from Mexico, from other parts of Central America and also from Latin America, actually makes the American population younger every year. In China, of course, it's just the opposite. Because you've had 30 years of the one-child policy, which has now changed, but because you've had it for 30 years, the Chinese population is getting older every day. And by the end of the century, China will have the highest concentration of people living into their 90s and into their 100s, and the smallest share of young people who can support them. And that can cause enormous social conflict. Now, it could change. China could now encourage strong population growth in the next 20, 30 years to try and deal with this. It could, of course, at some point have immigration. But a country that already has 1.3 billion people, where, of course, 800 million people still live in the countryside, are still dependent in some fundamental sense on agriculture, it's going to be very difficult to do this, because you have to first raise their living standards. And there's no welfare state in China, there's no safety net. So who do people depend on? Parents depend on their children, grandparents depend on their children and their grandchildren for support in old age. Now, it's already happening. The young Chinese people who work in the cities are sending money to their families in the country. But how long is that sustainable? When life in cities gets very expensive, and you can no longer afford to support your families in the countryside. So there's enormous potential for social conflict in China. I'm not making a prediction, I'm just saying it's a trend to bear in mind. Secondly, as I said, the transatlantic alliance, NATO, really remains the only global military alliance that can intervene. And that doesn't seem to be changing, because the countries that we're talking about that could rival NATO are very attached to national sovereignty. China, Russia, India, other countries want to preserve national sovereignty. They don't want to pool it with other countries. But that's what NATO does. NATO pools sovereignty. Other countries want to preserve their national sovereignty. It's a big difference. And thirdly, for the moment, China is neither able nor willing to replace the United States as the sole superpower. Will it do it in 50 years or 100 years? Who knows? But for the moment, it's not actually able, because it's still way behind if you look at per capita income. If you look at those 800 million Chinese I mentioned, who basically still live in rural areas, are basically peasants or depend on money from the cities, but can't really be called like a middle class. And also, probably for the moment, China is not willing, because it doesn't really know exactly how to lead the world. It doesn't really know what to do. China is as a civilization, or has been as a civilization, quite focused on itself and not really on the rest of the world. It's not really an expanding imperial power in that sense. Okay? And culturally, of course, that would require a big change. Now, let me go on a little bit and say a few things about the current dynamics. What else are we seeing? We're not just seeing some competition at the level of individual countries. US powers being challenged by China, by Russia, to some extent by India, and maybe a little bit by parts of Europe. But other important dynamics are also true. One thing that's definitely happening is that we're moving away from foreign policy that's based on a certain set of values. That was very much the case in 1990. It was all about spreading democracy, spreading human rights, spreading civil society, right? All of the things we associate with liberal democracies. That was the foreign policy in the 1990s, at least of the major Western countries. But what are we seeing today? Today we're seeing the American president, Donald Trump, talk about what? Does he talk about promoting democracy in the world? No. Is he talking about defending human rights in the world? Certainly not. Is he interested in climate change? Absolutely not. He's taking the United States out of the Paris Agreement. Is he interested in strengthening civil society in the rest of the world? He's never mentioned it. When he gave a speech on national security just 2 days ago, he didn't mention any of these things. What did he mention? America first. That's his foreign policy. Making America great again. That's his outlook. It's all about national interest. Now you might say, and I think you're right, America's always promoted national interest. In fact, there is no big country that doesn't promote its national interest, right? That's what big countries do. They promote their own national interest. They might call it something else, but that's what they do. And of course, you are right. That's always been the case. It was the case of the first sort of, powers that were acting in the international system going back, 400 years, even small Italian city-states, they were all about promoting their interests against others. You can go back in history to Greece and Rome, or to Alexander the Great. All empires were always defending their national interests. Of course they were. So you might say, what's changed? Well, something very important has changed, which is countries are no longer saying that actually it's national interest and certain values. Because ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Chinese dynasties 2,000 years ago, Alexander the Great, or Italian city-states 500 years ago, or the British Empire 150 years ago, or America 80 years ago was defending values. Now you might say it's hypocritical. They talk about democracy and they support dictatorship. You're right. Hypocrisy has always been true. I mean, it's part of politics, it's part of human life. But starting with President Woodrow Wilson after the end of World War I, America really was supporting democracy. And it was doing it in quite extreme ways. It was replacing regimes. Why did it want democracy? Because it didn't want to be challenged by other powers. So starting off in Central and Latin America, the United States defended democracy because it wanted friendly countries on its border. Countries that wouldn't go to war against the United States. It's called the Monroe Doctrine, and it goes back to 1832. America's always wanted friendly regimes on its border. Now you might say again, which country doesn't? China wants friendly regime on its border, that's why it's intervening in Vietnam, in Cambodia, right, in certain ways. Russia wants friendly countries on its border, that's why it doesn't like the idea of, Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. I get that. What's happening in Ukraine is complex, but you understand that a country like Russia doesn't want an openly hostile country on its immediate border. Right? Which country does? No one. India doesn't want a hostile country, and that's why there are problems with Pakistan and China, because they haven't resolved fundamental differences, and that's why the biggest threat other than North Korea is a conflict involving either India and Pakistan or India and China, because these are unresolved questions going back a long time. But all great powers want friendly regimes on their borders. That's what happens, because you don't want to be threatened by your neighbors, however small they might be. We can debate the means and the methods of trying to do this, but that's what big countries do. And in that sense, the whole period from Woodrow Wilson to Donald Trump is only different in one sense. It's only different about the means. The ends are the same. America wants to defend national interest, and it wants to do so by having all sorts of allies on its doorstep and elsewhere. So does Donald Trump, but he no longer thinks democracy, human rights are the best means of achieving this. He thinks it's much better to talk directly about national interest and not to talk about values. Values are just getting in the way. That's the big change. The other change is that we are going from multilateralism, which is what we did after 1945, right? United Nations, Bretton Woods institutions, all this cooperation. Then after 1989, even more so, World Trade Organization, all the kind of international organizations that you know about, we're going from that back to a balance of power. Much more like we saw after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, or maybe after 1919, when we had a balance of power following the First World War. Very few people are now trying to defend multilateralism. The European Union is, because it itself is a multilateral organization for its members. But who else is defending multilateralism? Practically nobody, except for the United Nations. Everyone likes the UN. Why? Because everyone has a veto. And that's quite convenient. I mean, at least in terms of the General Assembly. And then, of course, for the Security Council, the 5 permanent members like it because they have power. They can use their veto and no one else can. But it's not really multilateralism if you think about it. Because again, it's about countries being able to say no. The permanent members can say no in the Security Council, and if the General Assembly votes, countries can use their veto there on important questions. So is it really multilateralism? I'm not so sure. It's much more like a balance of power. That's the second big change. And the third big change we're seeing is, I think, that certain ideas about globalization, about supranational levels are being pushed back. In some sense, we are now seeing the most sustained backlash against globalization for the last 40 years. Globalization has benefited many countries, or at least many people within countries, but it also has led to huge economic and social disruption. And even in China, they realize that globalization cannot continue quite in the same way. Now, the president of China, Xi Jinping, went to the Davos Forum, the World Economic Forum, in January of this year. And he said, we are defending globalization. Why was he saying this? Because he knew that 3 days later, when Donald Trump was inaugurated as the American president, he would say, you know, it's America first. But it's very interesting how Xi Jinping defended globalization. He basically said it benefits national economies. So even he is speaking the language of national economies. And, quite crucially, for Xi Jinping, globalization basically means China can export its goods and China can benefit from technology. What it doesn't mean is sharing power. Right? China is not interested in sharing power with other countries. China is not interested in multilateralism. China is not interested in democracy and human rights. China is very much interested in Chinese development. And you might say that's understandable. So this 1990s now suddenly looks much more like the exception in recent history. Multilateralism, democracy, human rights. That's not really the norm. It seems to be more the exception in international relations. Again, we can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I'm just trying to point to some of the fundamental dynamics. And then let me mention a fourth and final one. And that is that actually we are also not moving towards a global culture. We're not moving towards one way of life. We're not moving towards a single identity that everyone shares across the world. We're not moving towards either an Americanized world or a completely, Sinonized world, so everyone sort of becoming or following a Chinese model. No. What we're actually seeing is a backlash against globalization in cultural terms and a reaffirmation, a reassertion of national identity. Now, that can take very different forms. You can have very strong forms of nationalism that even become ethnocentric, that can even take on racist forms, and of course can be very dangerous. No question. You have white supremacism in America. You've always had it. You had it with slavery. You've had it after the abolition of slavery with segregation. You've always had white supremacism in America as a cultural phenomenon, but it was a minority. 5%, 10%, probably no more than that. Very vocal, very powerful at some point, but not a majority. With the election of Donald Trump, you get a sense in which more people feel they can speak their mind. But even then, we're only probably talking 15, maybe maximum 20%. I think that's probably an overstatement. Much more so, people now feel that really it is time to talk about American national interest and national identity. It's a cultural thing. Especially white working class people in America want their identity to be recognized. They don't want to be ruled by the elites on the East Coast and the West Coast. They don't want to be ruled by liberals. Right? They don't want to be ruled by people like Hillary Clinton, who basically despises them. What did she call half of Trump's supporters? A basket of deplorables. In other words, here's someone who wants to become American president and at the same time says that she basically hates and despises 25% of the country. It's a very strange thing to do when you want to win an election. But of course she didn't say it publicly. When did she say it? She said it at a meeting with her donors. And where were these donors? They were all, of course, all from Wall Street, from Silicon Valley, and from Hollywood. In other words, they were precisely the East Coast and the West Coast elites. And in private, she said to them, half of the supporters of Donald Trump are basically people that I, Hillary Clinton, despise. But they happen to be American citizens who vote. And of course, you can understand why she lost, because people simply didn't think she represented a majority in the country. She won more votes, but where were her votes concentrated? In 2 of the 50 states, the state of New York, which is of course very liberal, and the state of California, which is even more liberal. So very concentrated. In the middle of the country, in the north and the south, Clinton got very few votes. So she simply did not represent her country. That's why she lost the election. Forget all the other talk. She lost the election. It's not even that Trump won. She lost an election, which even Barack Obama would have not lost, because at least he was able to mobilize a bit more broadly. He was able to mobilize, for instance, some of the black voters, would you believe it, who voted for Donald Trump. Why? Because he's much more direct in his language. They felt more represented by him than by Hillary Clinton because he speaks plain American to them. 28% of Latino voters voted for Donald Trump. Why? Because they felt that Clinton didn't understand their particular culture. They're very patriotic. They're Latinos who go to America and become very, very patriotic. She wasn't seen as patriotic. Think of the Indian Prime Minister, Modi. He's a patriot. Now, there might be elements of Hindu nationalism, sure. And, you know, violence with Muslim communities, which is very problematic, absolutely. But he is seen as a patriot. Think of the president of the Philippines, Duterte, very problematic figure, has waged a very brutal war on people who are caught up in drugs. You know, lots and lots of people have been killed by police, army, paramilitaries. It's very, very violent. But he's seen as a patriot. Right? Xi Jinping is a Chinese patriot, and you could say a Chinese nationalist, if you listen to some of the speeches that are not often translated. So patriotism and nationalism are on the rise, not some kind of abstract global identity, not cosmopolitanism. That is really not, at the moment, the dominant dynamic. So where does that all leave us? Let me just conclude in a few words. To go back to the starting point, in 1989, Francis Fukuyama said, we are seeing the end of history, meaning there will be a global convergence towards liberal democracy. All countries, sooner or later, he expected, would embrace this model. That was what we were told 25 years ago. 25 years later, of course, we see that none of this has really happened. Yes, liberal democracy is still there, but it's struggling. It's struggling even in the countries where it's been long established, in America, in Britain, in France, in Germany. And it's certainly not spreading. And it's not just that liberal democracy isn't spreading. It's also that the liberal international order, all the institutions that represent liberal ideas, like the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, are not really the dominant institutions any longer. Power is flowing towards great powers like China, India, Russia, maybe Brazil, maybe South Africa, maybe Nigeria. We can talk about Indonesia. You know, there are other countries on the rise as well. Power is certainly not flowing to some global level, some global elites. Now, there are still global structures that are quite powerful, we should not forget. Certain global businesses, think of the tech giants, Amazon, Apple, in China, Alibaba. I mean, these are powerful organizations. But of course, they're not controlled by countries. So can they really rival the power of a country like the US or China or Russia? I'm not so sure, but they're there, that's true. NATO is probably the single most powerful institution that isn't under direct national control. But even there, you could say America, because it's the dominant military power, of course, is really ultimately determining NATO's fate. But I think what's interesting is that we're seeing a shift, as I said, from values to national interest. We've seen a shift from multilateralism to national sovereignty, and we've seen a shift from any kind of cosmopolitan identity to national identity. There, I think, are the dominant dynamics. And now that I've spoken, I think, for just under an hour, I think I should stop here. Thank you all very much for your attention.